Hey guys, so this is my final build video on the Fractal Design Define 7 XL. I did a bunch of revisions in this case just to see what would work best. I'm going to tell you guys what I liked about building in it and some of the things I didn't like as much. That way, if you're going to build in this case, at least you'll have some idea of what to do. So let's get started. Hey guys, Tiago with Classical Technology here. Thank you for joining me for another video. Remember to smash that like button, subscribe if you like my content, leave a comment below. Were you thinking about building in this Define 7 XL case? Alright guys, so recently I did maybe 3 or 4 different revisions in this Define 7 XL case. Let's take a look at some of the things I did to it in this little B-roll video now. So as you can see, I tried a bunch of different things, different optimizations where I think it would fill the case out more. So I'm going to tell you guys some things to look out for when you're building in this case and maybe some things to keep in mind. First, let's talk about the size of the case. Now, of course, this is going to be the XL version. Generally, most people are going to be used to maybe the R6 or maybe even the Meshify S2, which are, they're fairly big cases, but they're not large by any means. They're just big in terms of being able to fit a decent amount of water cooling. And now the 7XL is definitely a large case. In fact, I moved most of my build from the Phanteks Lux 2 or the 719 or whatever they changed the name to. I moved it to this build. The case definitely is very high build quality. I definitely like the case. It has all the same elements as you would expect in a Fractal Design case. And of course with the added caveat that it is a pretty large case. Now this means that you can put a lot of water cooling in it, so this is going to be both a positive and a negative. The positive, of course, is that you can fill a decent amount of stuff in there. I mean, you can put a radiator on the top, on the front, and on the bottom. Now, I always think it's best for you to check the manufacturer's website if you want to know the exact specifications. They generally do a pretty good job of telling you what's going to fit on the top and on the bottom, on the front, just because radiators can vary so much. And of course, especially with that top radiator, you do need to be careful with ram clearance and just make sure that it's going to be able to fit. So the issue with the case being large, just keep in mind that if you don't put too much hardware in here, there's a chance that the case is going to feel a little bit empty. I mean, in some of my revisions, I did feel that maybe that hardware would have been better suited for the regular size version of this. So that basically would be the Define 7, the regular size, which is pretty much more or less the same size as the R6 and the Meshify 2 and things of that nature. The XL definitely runs the risk of feeling a little bit empty unless you do like a dual loop system. I tried to fill it in a little bit by putting the fans on the front and having that EK flat reservoir right there. Something else that actually made a nice difference in terms of filling out the case was using the vertical GPU, but because I'm using the Phanteks D140 water cooling panel on the back of the case, I couldn't use the provided vertical GPU mount on the case itself to mount the GPU, just because that block comes all the way down and it kind of blocks that access. But I was able to perfectly mount my GPU using the CableMod's vertical GPU mount. Now, what this basically does compared to the standard one that you get with the case, if you do it with the case provided, little slot, basically the GPU is going to be a lot further to the glass, and it's going to be back towards the back of the case more. Now the CableMods, because it has to go in the PCIe slots, it's going to be recessed in towards the motherboard and a little bit more in the case. So in this use case, in this final build that I did, I actually think it really helped me in 2 major ways. First, it allowed me to mount that D140 distribution block right in the back without obscuring any of the access. And then secondly, it allowed the GPU to come towards the center of the case a little bit more, therefore filling in some of that empty space. When I had it mounted just to the case, I did have a decent amount of empty space right between the reservoir and the GPU. Like I mentioned, this is a very large case. If this was just a regular sized, Define 7 or even a Define R6, I definitely wouldn't have that issue and it would look a little bit more uniform and it would fill that space out more. So having that vertical GPU bracket actually helped me fill out that space a little more. So now the main advantage of using the larger version is of course to fill more radiator space and make sure that everything isn't sort of crammed in on top of each other. Here, in a lot of cases like this, you can definitely fit a nice radiator on the roof. You can fit one on the front, and then even in the basement, of course, you might not be able to use a very long power supply. You may have to use a smaller one, like maybe an EVGA, you know, a G3 or something like that. They're generally going to be a little bit smaller. A really long power supply and a big radiator on the bottom, it's not really going to work too well. I have a 240 millimeter radiator on the bottom. I believe you should be able to fit upwards of like a 280 with a decent sized power supply or something like that. Then of course in the front something similar, and in the top of the case you can't fit up to a 480 millimeter radiator. I just thought it'd be a little bit overkill, and I had an extra 360 EK Performance Edition radiator lying around, so I happen to use that. But you can definitely fit a 480 up there, and if you're doing a case of this size, I would probably recommend it. If I do a different revision in this build where I have to change out the radiators, I may definitely fill in the space more, but I think the performance that I'm getting with the two radiators, I have one on the top, one on the bottom. We are using an Nvidia Titan Xp GPU, and of course we're also using a high-end Intel processor. Both can definitely tend to run pretty warm because they're high performing parts, but performance has been really good with this setup. Another note about doing a radiator on the front of the case, I opted to do it on the bottom and top just because I feel like I get better airflow there. Of course, the front of the case, you can fit a radiator in a lot of cases. If you're really going to fill out this case, you should, but just remember you're going to have a little bit more restricted air coming in through the front just because it's a closed off panel and you just have these little air vents on the side. That's why they make a Meshify version of this with a mesh front to give you really unimpeded airflow, and believe it or not, it definitely makes a pretty big difference. So knowing that, having built in these Fractal Design cases before, I figured since I kind of have that reservoir there anyway, the space there is a little bit tight for another radiator, so I figured let's put a radiator on the bottom of the case and one on top. I think for any high performance system, you do need at least two nice sized radiators. Of course, if you have more, like a 480 on top and a 360 somewhere, you're going to get even better performance. And remember, with water cooling, you do get diminishing returns the more radiators that you use, but you are going to be able to get quieter performance with your fans spinning at lower RPMs if you have a lot of radiator space. Some other interesting build notes on this case, I really like the way that the glass panel and the rear panel kind of snap in place. They go in a little track and you just sort of push them in place and they stay there. I think it's a really nice and intuitive way to put your panels on. I hate it when a case has a panel that you have to work with these difficult screws or it keeps falling off. So this is definitely a very nice way to do it. It's one of the elements that I like about the build quality of these cases, and they do design a lot of elements of this case with a lot of water cooler builders in mind. One thing I really like about the Define 7 as opposed to even the Meshify series, I do like the front. I mean, aside from the restricted airflow, I do like that it's a little door that you can open, and the front panel is very easy to just pull off if you have to work in the front. In the Meshify series, especially like the Meshify Mini, that front panel is not really detachable. You always have to flip it up, and for some reason it would always come down on my head, and it was a little bit harder to work on the front because that panel is connected. Of course, I do prefer the Meshify series in terms of performance just because you do get more airflow, but like I said, in this build I put the radiator on the bottom and on the top. Even if you put one on the front, yeah, you're going to get some restricted airflow, but you'll still get some pretty decent performance. I mean, you do have these air vents on the side, and you could always leave that front door open. That's very similar to the Be Quiet cases that have these sort of solid panels. I think they definitely look great, and if you really need to get some more air in there, of course, just open up that front door and you'll have a little bit more unimpeded access to it. It may not be practical to leave it open all the time, but it's just something to think about. Now, let's talk a little bit about the reservoir choices that I made for my water cooling loop. Initially, in one of my early revisions of this build, I used the Lian Li distribution block that's meant for the Lian Li Dynamic from EK Water Blocks. I actually mounted that on the front of the case, and I had everything running in parallel. I thought that build actually looked pretty cool. I did test it with just one radiator, which is usually something I wouldn't do, but I wanted to see what the performance was. And while it was okay, you definitely benefit from that second radiator either on the bottom. In that case, it has to be on the bottom because I put the distro plate on the front. I actually think that looked really cool. The only problem is you did have a lot of open space sort of where the tubes were running through. So I think this design may actually work really well in like a Meshify S2. And I have a future build coming with a Z490 10900K Intel processor on the Asus Apex motherboard. And I actually already have the Meshify S2 that I took some parts out of. I think I'm going to build in that using that EK distro plate on the front. And I think the smaller version of the case compared to this XL version, it's going to look and work a lot better. You're definitely not going to have as much of that empty space there. So I think that's definitely something I want to do. So then, considering that the space was a little bit too big, that's why I decided to use EK's flat reservoir. In this case, I happen to have the 240mm version. The 360 should also be able to fit. You're just going to have to take down that little floor panel. You should be able to go all the way to the bottom. But I think the 240 looks pretty nice in here. It's fairly balanced, especially with the vertical GPU mount from Cable Mods. It pushes the GPU towards the center a little bit more. And this plate is mounted directly to the back. You have these little brackets on the back of the reservoir themselves. It's fairly easy to mount. Of course, this reservoir does have a D5 pump, which was one of the big upgrades over the other distro, which just had a DDC pump. Generally, I do prefer D5 pumps. I think they're a little bit more powerful, as well as they run a lot more quiet. And while this 240mm flat reservoir doesn't give you the same options to do parallel runs as the Lian Li version does, I still think the usability of it is pretty good. You can route your tubing in different ways, and I think having the D5 pump in a really nice RGB clear sort of flat reservoir there looks really good in this case. And that brings us to our next point, and that's going to be sort of the visual aesthetics of this case. If you notice, everything is sort of like a distribution plate with RGB. I mean, starting at the CPU block, that's an EK Velocity RGB block. I actually think it's important to have these RGB elements in these clear blocks just because they look so good. Most of the time I'm going to keep it just on purple. Previously I had the acetal block on that GPU and it really didn't look that good just because the GPU was really kind of blacked out. That can look good in certain builds, even though I think the acetal is meant for like a maybe more of a horizontal build. In a vertical build, you really want to see that liquid, and especially on this Titan card, it looks absolutely incredible. That was the best upgrade that I did, going from acetal to a clear acrylic EK water block around it where you can see the liquid, you can see the RGB effects. It's definitely one of the most stunning visual aspects of this case. Of course, we have that Phanteks water distribution block from the top. I pulled that out of the Phanteks Lux 2 case that I had it in. It looks really good as well. You don't necessarily need it to route things through. It's more for the aesthetics. So basically you have that reservoir on the front, which is a flat panel. You get to see all the liquid with RGB. You have your GPU, your CPU block, and then that panel on the back. It becomes almost like a nice water park in here with all these visual elements. That's something that I really liked. So the color theme as well as these visual clear blocks, that's definitely going to be my favorite part about building in this case. I mean, it's such a nice expansive case that you do get to get all of these elements in there without being too crowded. And I think because it is such a large case, either you fill it with very thick radiators as much as you can and maybe even push-pull fans, or you do something like this where you have these clear acrylic blocks to give you a nice visual feel and really fill out the case. Because the only drawback to this case really is that it can tend to look a little bit empty unless you fill it up with hardware. In that case, I would recommend you just build in a smaller regular version of the case. It's going to be a lot easier for you. You're not going to have to fill it up with as much hardware, but if you have some interesting things that you know you're going to be able to fill this up with, either really big reservoirs, maybe a dual loop, a dual pump system would look really good in here, really thick, large, wide radiators as well would look really good, or a lot of components, then yeah, of course, build in this case. But otherwise, I think most people are going to be well served by building in a smaller version of this case, and it's also going to be easier to move. This bad boy is really heavy and awkward to carry around. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video and this build. See you guys on the next video. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button. Alright, take care.